Welcome to Nice and Blunt. I'm Adam Riancho, and these are my quarterback, tight end, and defensive rankings for Week 16, the second week of the fantasy playoffs. Big week, very important to get the win. So we're going to start off with the weather report. I think at quarterback and defense especially, weather's a huge factor, especially at this time of the year. It could sway your decisions, especially if you have like a tiebreaker between two players. There's three games with kind of concerning weather I want to mention. The Packers game on Monday night is going to be snowing, at least a 20% chance, but at 33 degrees, I really expect it to happen, and it's going to be more of a conservative run-first game plan, in my opinion. I don't think they need to be throwing it very much in order to beat the Saints, and maybe Spencer Rattler is really limited as well. So that's an interesting game. But in Seattle, there's a 65% chance of rain. And after two games torching opponents at home indoors, maybe Darnold does look vulnerable in the elements. This will be a determining factor regarding his next contract. Can he play just as well in the elements? So maybe he's actually the Seahawks quarterback next season. I wouldn't be shocked if that happened. But there's also the Bills game, which is 16 degrees, 16 degrees. And while there's a chance that it's going to be snowing, odds are it's going to be ending around noon, and they're going to be sweeping it up in those 4 hours before kickoff. So that'll be interesting. Maybe the snow just keeps falling during the game, but there's a slight chance it will be snowing in Chicago. It looks unlikely at the moment, and the storm was kind of pushed up in terms of when it'll be ending. So I'm not too worried about any snow, but it is going to be 32 degrees in Chicago. It's also going to be cold as fuck in Kansas City, 36 degrees on Saturday for the Chiefs and Texans, 37 degrees for the Ravens and Steelers in Baltimore with 15 miles per hour winds. That's close enough to maybe raise your eyebrow at. But in Cincinnati on Sunday, 34 degrees for the Bengals and Browns. In New York for the Jets and Rams, 25 degrees. Maybe the Rams offense won't look as good traveling cross country in the cold weather. LA's not used to it. So that'll be interesting. But in Washington, it's also right at 32 degrees. It's not going to snow apparently, but the temperature is pretty frigid. In Carolina, maybe the Cardinals offense is limited in 41 degree temperature. Kyler Murray didn't sound too excited when he found out about it. Lastly, in Miami, it'll be 75 degrees, so not a factor at all. Maybe the Niners and Dolphins get an upgrade because of that. But there's also 4 indoor games to mention. Maybe if you want to take the elements out of it entirely, look to the Falcons and Giants game in Atlanta, or the Colts-Titans game in Indianapolis, the Raiders-Jaguars game in Las Vegas, and lastly, the Buccaneers-Cowboys game on Sunday night primetime in Dallas. Baker probably going to go off alongside Mike Evans, maybe Jalen McMillan as well. So those are very important weather updates I wanted to share, and I also wanted to bring up some data as well. These are some scoring trends at the quarterback position. We're going to start at quarterback in this video, and Josh Allen's on a massive heater, almost just entirely off the page on this chart, an average of over 36 points per game the last month. If you have Allen, you're not benching him. Despite the snow, I do not care. There's no chance. I'm benching the MVP. The next player on this list would be Lamar Jackson, who's been consistent all season long, an average of 25 points per game. But the matchup against the Steelers is usually his worst spot to be in. I will bring up some stats. I'm not ranking Lamar this high this week, but I don't think you can bench him if you have him, unless you have a guy like Josh Allen or maybe somebody else I rank in the top 3. But next up on the list would be Jayden Daniels, who's getting back to great recently. He was in a bit of a slump. That rib injury did cost him some rushing stats, but he's back on track at the moment against the Eagles. Not the easiest matchup, but still, they're going to need him, and it's probably a high-scoring game. I'm definitely starting Jayden Daniels this week. Behind Jayden, we have Jared Goff, who had a massive, almost 500-yard game last week. And given their defense is terrible, even against the Bears, I know they'll have to score a lot. And with Montgomery now out, you expect more pass attempts from Jared Goff. So it's one of the only games this season for him in the elements. Odds are it doesn't impact him that much. He was fine against the Packers in the rain. I think he'll be fine against Chicago in the cold. So I would be starting Jared Goff after last week. You cannot bench Jared Goff. Behind him, Joe Burrow did fall back down a little bit. Down to 22.4, definitely still a player you're starting. He's been elite all season long. No concerns with Burrow. But historically, he doesn't play great against the Browns. We'll get into those stats later on. I think on name value, though, you're not benching Burrow. At number 6, we have Sam Darnold, who played lights out, but the last 2 games were at home, indoors, and he's playing in the rain in Seattle. So as I mentioned, a real test. I would downgrade him a little bit, but he's been so good. He has such good weapons. He has 10 touchdowns, only 1 interception the last month. I would probably still be starting Sam Darnold. Behind Darnold, we have Jalen Hurts, who's getting back to what we expected last week was phenomenal from Hurts, and they decided to pass the ball. But against the Commanders this week, a good secondary. Wouldn't shock me if they pivoted back in favor of the run game and Saquon Barkley. So that could be the only issue with Hurts, but in general, you have to start him. He's not throwing it very much, though, in general. Still, even after last week, averaging less than 175 passing yards per game, but with 43 on the ground, it kind of compensates. You don't really worry about Hurts from a floor standpoint, but maybe the ceiling isn't as high this week as it was against the Steelers. Behind Hurts, we have Baker Mayfield, who had a bit of a dip, but lately he's back on track, back to top 10. And I think against the Cowboys indoors on Sunday night, he's going to dominate. He torched the Chargers. The Bucs hung 40 against a great defense. The Cowboys can't win at home this season. Baker's going to be phenomenal this week. I think Baker is my start of the week. Love Baker Mayfield this week. Going to play excellent football on Sunday night. But after him, we have Tua Tagovailoa, who still ranks highly in the top 10 despite a terrible game. He had 4 turnovers last week, and that was atrocious. But Tua is averaging over 300 yards per game. He's playing at home this week against the Niners. I would expect Tua to still probably be fine. Number 10 is Aaron Rodgers, who had a great game last week, starting to play better. He had 45 rushing yards last week. I don't know if that's something to bet on, but 18.9 points as an average for Rodgers does rank top 10. So a great matchup for him against the Rams. It's a Stafford-Rodgers rivalry game. Could be a shootout. Against the Rams wouldn't shock me if Devontae Adams put up another massive game. And Rodgers threw multiple touchdowns close to 300 yards for the second week in a row. Number 11, we have Caleb Williams, who is still kind of hovering despite some huge boom-bust games. You're either getting 25-plus points from Caleb or less than 12. Caleb really has no in-between, and maybe against the Lions' defense, this is a good spot for him. The ceiling is open on Caleb this week, but we know the floor kind of doesn't exist. But lately, overall, he does rank top 12. Right above Patrick Mahomes. Technically, they're tied, but overall, Caleb does offer you slightly more rushing yards in general, but 18.8 points for both of them. So Mahomes is decent. The matchup against the Texans, though, is kind of tough. He got banged up, but usually he steps up when injured. I wouldn't really be downgrading Mahomes at all. He'll be around quarterback 12 or so in my rankings for sure. Number 13 is Bo Nix, who I did tell you was a decent floor play, but did offer some rushing stats for the first time in a while this week and did offer 20 plus points last night against the Chargers. He was a good play. Bo Nix was worth it. But Richardson comes in right behind him with 47 rushing yards per game and 4 rushing touchdowns last month. That's all you're kind of betting on with Richardson. At home in the Dome, maybe he has a good week. The ceiling is also open for Richardson this week, in my opinion. Behind him is Mason Rudolph, and Rudolph has played in 4 different games this year. In those 4 games, he's actually a decent quarterback, middle of the pack, 17.2 points. Isn't terrible from Mason Rudolph. So the Colts game at least doesn't have any weather to worry about, but Richardson and Rudolph back-to-back, that game could be a potential shootout that we don't see coming. Behind him is Jordan Love, who I mentioned with the weather I would be benching. He's only league average in the first place. If you're not doing better than Mason Rudolph, then you need a really good matchup for me to feel confident in starting you. So no go on Jordan Love this week, one of my clear bench options. And then at number 17, we have Russell Wilson, who did not play well against the Ravens last time, and with no George Pickens, I don't expect him to be better. So I'd also be benching Russell Wilson for sure. Bryce Young gets the Panthers in the cold. Not a good matchup. I think I'd be benching Bryce Young. I think his average will go down this week against the Cardinals, but maybe it stays top 20. Number 19 is Drake May, who offers some rushing upside, but not much more. Usually there's about as many turnovers as touchdowns for Drake May. So in the rush department, that's really the only saving grace, but it does keep the floor decent. He was a good option in your lineup last week in a difficult matchup himself. Stafford had a terrible game with no touchdowns in the rain last week, but he was on such a heater before. I do expect him to bounce back. I think 16 points represents his floor, and I do think Stafford will play well. It's a good matchup, actually, at the moment against a banged-up Jets secondary. Then we have Cooper Rush, who's keeping the floor decent at 15.7, kind of bust-proof, but no real upside. Then Jameis Winston just got benched for DTR. Drew Lock offers some high rushing value, surprisingly, but not any actual touchdown potential. Drew Lock is not that safe in terms of ceiling, but for floor, does average 13.9 points in 2 games this season. Then CJ Stroud has been a very disappointing player. I wouldn't be starting him against the Chiefs this week. And then Kyler Murray, also a big disappointment in the cold in Carolina. I don't think he's a safe start, but maybe on the ground, he really torches them. The Panthers' run defense is one of the worst in the NFL this year. Then Justin Herbert had a rough month, so I did tell you he was more of a floor play. He was much better if you started Herbert last night. He did pay off with over 20 points in fantasy. Then Mac Jones at 12 points. He's not safe in general, but did have a good game last week. Brian Thomas could save his fantasy upside, but then Brock Purdy with a terrible 2-game stretch. The weather, I think, is the main reason. He should bounce back against the Dolphins on Sunday after a long week of rest. And then Geno gets a rainy game this week and off the knee injury. I'm not too excited to trust him, but maybe he plays better given his job is on the line. And then at 31, Spencer Rattler, no thank you, below 10 points. Lastly on the list, not a surprise why he got benched at all. Kirk Cousins averaging only 5.8 points per game in the last month, 1 touchdown, 8 turnovers, and it gets even uglier if we look back more than 4 games. So we'll get Michael Penix this week. Maybe he does play well. There are some good weapons in that Falcons offense, but odds are with the rookie, they probably just lean on the run game against the Giants in the first place. So those are the scoring trends. Now let's bring up some matchup details where overall the league average is hovering at about 17 points. So I think unless you're getting like 20 plus points, it's not a huge upgrade. There's kind of a wide league average department in terms of matchups. But the number one matchup right now would be the Bengals, who have been pretty good on the season. The Bengals defense has sucked, so expect over 20 points against their opponent usually. But with DTR on the other side, it's going to probably rely on rushing stats. So Dorian Thompson-Robinson might be running it a lot this week against Cincinnati. Next up, they're in a very bad slump right now on defense. The Jets have cratered without Robert Saleh. They're giving up a ton of points to quarterbacks. 21.9 is the second best matchup at the moment. So Stafford gets a major upgrade. I don't really care that he's on the road in the cold. I expect a high point total, especially because the Rams rank right behind them, giving up 20.3. The number's kind of inflated by the Josh Allen matchup, but still Rodgers has been playing better lately. And now that he's more removed from the Achilles injury, I do think with only the stats on the line for, the record books, I do think Rodgers will put up another decent game against Stafford. I see a shootout in New York. Technically, New Jersey. After that, we have the Falcons, but it's a matchup against Drew Lock. I don't know if you trust Drew Lock, so that's kind of irrelevant. Then the Lions, with their injuries on defense, have really been depleted and giving up a ton of points. We saw Josh Allen torch them, though, and obviously that does inflate the numbers. Just like the Rams, maybe they're not as good as this chart would suggest. But on the season, they're actually below average. Maybe that is what you should worry about. But behind Detroit, the Jaguars have been a little bit better lately, but on the season, the best matchup for quarterbacks overall. So Desmond Ridder may be worth a shot in DFS. I would not be starting him in the playoffs, though. Only in a deep superflex league, if you're in the consolation bracket, would I consider Desmond Ridder. Then the Chargers have been a rough matchup on the season, but lately their defense is too injured to really stop anyone, and Bo Nix did play well. Bo Nix was a good play on Thursday. Then the Panthers on the year have been a decent top 10 matchup, giving up an average of 19.1 points all year, and they get Kyler Murray. In terms of rushing stats, I would be excited about Kyler against Carolina, but the weather might shut him down. The weather could be a problem. Kyler played like shit when it was raining in Green Bay and Seattle. It's not raining, though, in Carolina. It's just cold, so do with that what you will. odds are, though, it's an upgrade for Kyler, who's been a bad fantasy quarterback for a few weeks now. But behind Carolina would be Dallas, one of my last true upgrades. Giving up 18.5 points isn't like insanely good, but it is top 10. So the Cowboys against Baker Mayfield are a big upgrade. I would definitely be starting Baker this week with Mike Evans in primetime. They're going to torch the Cowboys on Sunday night. But the last two, just to like maybe bring up, would be the Patriots and Bills matchup. But given there's the snow and on the season, they've been tougher matchups, I'm not considering that a real upgrade in general. In terms of downgrades, there's two that are clearly ones to avoid. The Texans rank league worst at 11.7 the last 5 games, but on the year closer to 15 points. Maybe Mahomes is still fine in your lineup. I wouldn't downgrade him too much. I think he'll be fine against the Texans on Saturday. But then Arizona is a tough spot lately, and they get Bryce Young. I don't think anyone's really trusting Bryce Young at the moment, so no go with Bryce Young. Then the Packers get the snow and Spencer Rattler, so no fucking chance. I'm going to start Rattler this week. And then it's the Chiefs who get CJ Stroud, who's been terrible this season. If he's not throwing a touchdown to Nico Collins, he's not giving you anything. He's not even really going over 210 yards half the time. Stroud is a terrible fantasy quarterback this year. But just above the Chiefs is the Vikings, who have been a tough matchup all year long. And in the rain, I'd have some big red flags for Geno Smith. Off the knee injury, I'd probably pass on Geno. But then it's the Colts, who have been much tougher lately and bottom 10 as of late. The Colts get Mason Rudolph, but with no weather. Perhaps if you're super desperate in Superflex, you might consider Rudolph at the bottom of the barrel in a deep league. But then it would be Seattle, who get Sam Darnold, and maybe you're going to downgrade Darnold, especially with the rain. I do have a minor red flag with Darnold, but I think he's just played so well with those weapons. I think the upside's too high to worry about. So Darnold, I think, is still a decent top 10 play, but maybe not top 3 anymore. And then Philly, also a tough matchup on the year. And Jayden Daniels, without any rushing stats, could get burned again. He was really bad the first time around, but he was injured. That rib injury did force him to not run the ball a decent amount. So Daniels is an interesting option. He could burn you, but odds are he does go off once again. And then lastly, at 15.5 points, we have Miami, who's been much tougher on the year, actually the most difficult matchup on the season. But in Miami with no weather to worry about, I still think Purdy is a decent play. Shanahan against his apprentice McDaniel probably dials up a good game plan. So those are all of the matchups I wanted to mention, all the downgrades and upgrades. And now let's get into the rankings. Let's talk quarterbacks. At number 1, I think on the hot streak, you cannot bench Josh Allen at the moment. So that one's obvious. Number 2, I also don't think you're benching Joe Burrow. He's been elite this year. And against the Browns, I think he will kind of beat his boogeyman. But historically, he does not play well against the Browns. He has a losing record against them. The last 3 games, he has won 2 of them, and I think he'll be fine. But in 7 career games versus Cleveland, his fantasy average is only 16.3 points. I think he's going to be a fine play. I wouldn't bench Burrow, but maybe you're going to read into these numbers and consider him a downgrade. I personally would not. I would still start Burrow. The only one I'd bench him for is Josh Allen. But then at number 3, he had a slight dip in production a few weeks ago, but now is back on track. I think Baker Mayfield is an elite option. I almost ranked him at number 1. I'm going to be honest with you. I was tempted to do that. He gets a top 9 matchup in primetime. The only better plays are Allen and Burrow. And given the weather for Allen and the divisional matchup for Burrow, I actually see a higher ceiling for Baker. I think the variance actually could lead Baker to be the best play this week. So he's in this elite tier, but based on how effective Allen and Burrow have been, I am going to keep them ranked above Baker. But at number 3, I'm definitely telling you, start Mayfield on Sunday. The next tier, there is a slight chance of risk, but I think based on their track record this season, you cannot bench any of these 4 players. I have Jalen Hurts and Jayden Daniels at 4 and 5 in that matchup. In division, I expect them to play very well against each other. At least in fantasy, I think it's more of a shootout than a low-scoring game. Both teams have good defenses, so I could be wrong, but I think in general, you want to be starting these 2 rushing quarterbacks. The upside's just too high. They both probably offer you like 50-plus rushing yards, and that type of floor is just too good to bench. You have to start Hurts and Daniels, but in division, it could be a weird game. Maybe it's more like a 24-27 matchup than like a 35-38. type of matchup. You know what I'm saying? Maybe it's more average in terms of scoring than elite. Perhaps it's not the shootout some people might expect. And then at number 6, I have Jared Goff, who I definitely expect to fall back down to earth after such an elite game last week. He's not going to put up close to 500 yards against the Bears. It's a divisional game. It could turn into a shootout. I'm not going to discredit his ceiling. We all know Goff can have an elite performance any given week, but it's one of the few games this year that's in the elements. Weather's a real factor. It's going to be cold, but probably not snowing. And with no Montgomery, they probably lean on Gibbs, but Gibbs is more of a pass catcher. I do expect Goff to be throwing it a lot. So I trust the floor. It's a question of what the turnovers look like, because historically he plays very poorly in fantasy against the Bears. And his last 5 games versus Chicago, Goff is averaging only 14.1 points per game on 222 yards per game, 9 touchdowns, 6 turnovers, and you know he offers nothing on the ground. So that's the only concern with Goff. If he doesn't have a blow-up game, his floor is like 15 points, but I think he'll be fine. I definitely starting him after last week. I wouldn't be benching him, but I do trust the running quarterbacks Hurts and Daniels more, as well as the ceiling with Baker, Burrow, and Allen, who on the year have been a bit safer than Goff. So I think he falls down a little bit. After last week, you can't expect a 500-yard game every time, but I would be starting Goff for sure. At number 6, I think he's a good option. Definitely should be in your lineup this week. At number 7, we got Lamar Jackson versus Pittsburgh, and I know you're going to tell me, why do you have Lamar Jackson so low? But if you have never watched a Ravens-Steelers game, then you're really not paying attention, and you don't understand the red flag that this matchup offers. In 5 career games versus the Steelers, Lamar is not a good fantasy quarterback at all. An average of 12.1 points per game is brutal. 213 yards, 5 touchdowns, 11 turnovers, and 56 rushing yards per game with not a single rushing touchdown. So the rushing yards are really the only saving grace, the only silver lining, and an average of 12 points is a nightmare. You could absolutely lose your matchup this week if you start Lamar Jackson. But given how important this game is, it is their only chance to win the division. If they lose it, it's pretty much completely out of reach. I do think he plays fine. I think if you have Lamar, the thought of actually benching him does sound foolish, but expect a diminished floor, expect a low-end game from Lamar. You could totally get burned. I wanted to rank him lower, but I just don't think I can. At number 7, it's the lowest I can justify. Lamar is not going to be his best against Pittsburgh. But at number 8, I think we're dropping down a tier, and I think everyone in this range, 8 through 15, is all kind of identical, all in the streaming category. But on the higher end of the spectrum, in the top 10, I would be starting Sam Darnold at Seattle. The Justin Jefferson-Addison combo is just too much of a threat to score at any time, and despite the rainfall, I still think Darnold's going to play very well. I trust Kevin O'Connell to make any quarterback in this system effective. But Darnold is going to be still a top 10 play this week. He's the quarterback 6 in the last month with 10 touchdowns, only 1 turnover, 286 yards per game. I don't think I'd be benching Sam Darnold. His contract is on the line. He's got to prove he can play just as well in the elements. Number 9, I got Matthew Stafford at the Jets, followed by Aaron Rodgers in the exact same game versus the Rams. I mentioned in the charts, both players have top 3 matchups. The Jets have been really susceptible to quarterbacks lately, giving up the second most fantasy points the last 5 weeks. And then at number 3 would be the Rams. So neither secondary is good at all right now. And given it's a home field advantage for the Jets, I do think Rodgers could step up, could play well. So I see a very high scoring game. It's going to be really cold, 25 degrees, but both quarterbacks used to play in Lambeau against each other a lot, and I'm not worried about it at all. I do trust Devontae Adams, Garrett Wilson, and Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp to really be effective in the passing game. I would be starting both Stafford and Rodgers this week, both top 10 plays, in my opinion. I would like to chase the upside in that matchup in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Then in Miami, I have both quarterbacks back-to-back as well. I got Tua at number 11 and Brock Purdy at the Dolphins. So I would also be trying to start them, but more so in a deeper league. Only in a 12 quarterback format do I consider them must starts in week 16. But Tua needs to bounce back. He had 4 turnovers last week. He was on a hot streak with no turnovers for over a month. And at the moment, he's still averaging 300 plus yards per game. But the turnovers were a big red flag. Jalen Waddle's not fully healthy. And actually, the Niners do shut down tight ends very well. So maybe if Jonnu Smith does get locked up. Tyreek Hill will need to really step up for Tua to be effective, but Tua usually plays very well at home. I know for a fact this game means a lot to the head coach, and I expect a major bounce back on offense from the Miami Dolphins against the Niners. So I think Tua is a safe floor play with high-end upside. If Tyreek Hill can get back in the end zone, then I think Tua will be a very, very good play. But last week was a red flag. Tua's still a top 10 quarterback, though, in the last month. I would rely on him, given it's a home game against San Francisco. But in the same game right behind him, I got Brock Purdy, and Purdy did put up a terrible game in the weather the last 2 weeks, but in general, he's pretty effective. So as long as Debo doesn't drop every pass, then I think Purdy will be fine. But after last week, I envision a lot fewer targets and opportunities for Debo Samuel. So expect Purdy to be leaned on heavily, especially with Kittle and Juwan Jennings. I don't know how much they trust Patrick Taylor. Yet another running back injury to Garendo in San Francisco. So what is this, the fifth stringer now getting the start at running back for the Niners? I think Purdy will be leaned on in the passing game. I think he'll be a fine start, a top 12 play this week. And then at number 13, we have Mahomes, who is the quarterback 12 on average the last 4 games. But this matchup is the worst you can find, so a slight downgrade. I think he'll be fine. I don't worry about him too much. I think from a floor standpoint, he at least gives you like 16, 17, 18 or so points. I doubt he goes over 20, but I would be probably starting him at number 13. I think he's a high-end streaming option, but in a 12-team league, the only guy you can probably get off of the waiver wire to start above him would be Aaron Rodgers. I would only go Rodgers off the wire above Mahomes this week. But given you're supposed to start your studs in the playoffs, you probably don't want to do that. That probably sounds a bit foolish coming out of my mouth. But number 14 and 15, I did tell you were low-end floor plays that were worth starting, but maybe more of just a streaming option this week. I had Bo Nix and Herbert back-to-back at 14 and 15, and both players went over 20 points. Nix got back to running the ball. That was very nice to see. And Herbert had an insane game, multiple passing touchdowns, and a lot of rushing yards as well. His touchdown to Darius Davis was an insane throw as he was falling to his left. I'm such a big fan of Justin Herbert. So I did rank him top 15. They were a bit better than I expected, but based on the track record lately, they were a bit riskier in your lineup. But beyond this point, I think we're kind of playing with fire. There's a chance for major success. I see a massive ceiling for the next 5 players. However, it's a different tier, and there's always a chance they can burn you. Like Caleb Williams was terrible last week, but a few weeks ago against the Lions, he had 26 fantasy points with 39 rushing yards and 3 passing touchdowns. It could always happen again. The Lions defense is terrible right now. It's a top 5 matchup on paper, and Caleb is actually a top 10 quarterback in the last month. So I do have him at the top of the tier. There's a very high ceiling, but a lot of risk if he doesn't pay off, and that's why I did tell you to start Herbert above him last night. So a safer floor with a guy like Herbert, but higher ceiling with Caleb. I could envision a potential 30-point game if the Lions defense can't stop him in the first half. Caleb usually has a good second half, rarely throws an interception or turnover, but usually in the first half, he is dog shit. So that's the risk. Caleb could be terrible in division, but I do see a lot of upside. I do think in a top 5 matchup, Caleb has the highest ceiling of all the remaining options this week. And then at number 17, we have Kyler, who gets a very good matchup on the ground against Carolina. The Panthers give up over 157 rushing yards per game on the ground to just the running back position. They also give up 32 yards per game on the ground to quarterbacks. So if Kyler goes over 70 rushing yards this week, I wouldn't be shocked at all. Maybe they reserve that for James Conner. But the only 2 red flags I can point to for Kyler are the weather. It's a cold game in Carolina this week. And the fact that Kyler's been dog shit, the quarterback 25 in fantasy the last month, only 12.9 points per game on average. He is not a high upside option at all. So I would worry about it. He's not running it anywhere near as much. And if not for this matchup, I wouldn't rank him top 20 at all. I'd probably still bench Kyler in a 1-quarterback league. But at 18, there is some upside for Anthony Richardson with his rushing value. The weather's not a factor in that game. And he is a top 15 quarterback, averaging 18.4 points in his last 4 games. So it's the rushing value. He usually offers a rushing touchdown and almost like 50 rushing yards every week. And if you get 11 points on the ground as a floor, then everything in the passing game is just a bonus. So Richardson, a very compelling start in Superflex, but given it's the playoffs, the risk factor probably is worth ignoring and benching, I'd probably avoid Richardson in a typical league where you only start 12 guys. But at 19, Drake May is also pretty compelling from a rush yard standpoint. Last week, he was pretty effective, and that was a tough matchup. In the snow, maybe it's a tough matchup against the Bills as well, but on paper, it's actually top 11. They did just get torched by Jared Goff. So I don't know if I trust Drake May that much, but he's a decent top 20 play himself lately. He's the quarterback 19 on points per game, and I do rank him at number 19. I expect about 16 points from Drake May, but with the rushing upside, occasionally he goes over 19. At number 20, I do have Michael Penix Jr. versus the Giants, and there is tremendous upside. He looked fantastic playing for the Huskies last season. He also looked decent in the preseason, but we've never seen him in the regular season. It's a completely unknown factor. The matchup is top 12. The weather's non-existent. It's indoors at home. If there was ever a spot to be starting a rookie quarterback, it would be here against a team that's vying for the number one pick. So Penix should be fine, but they're also probably going to lean on Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. The Giants are a very good matchup on the ground. So they're not going to expose Penix to too many opportunities to make a mistake. Even if they don't get the division against Tampa, they still have a shot at the wild card if they win out and beat the Commanders next week, and at 10 wins have the tiebreaker. So a very important game not to mess up, and that's why the risk factor with Penix is a little bit higher than I would probably anticipate. The Giants are a good matchup here, but I really have no idea what to expect for sure. So the floor is non-existent. Cousins has been so dog shit, and I really don't trust Mooney ever since his injury. He's not the same player. Kyle Pitts is not playing well at all. I don't think that's just a Cousins situation. And then London isn't really the safest bet to find the end zone. I think London will be fine, but Penix may not get anyone else involved. He might just be handing it off to Bijan and Algier most of the game. So I'm a bit concerned. I wouldn't start him unless it's a two quarterback format, but the upside is tremendous if he plays as well as he did in college. Penix should have been on the field a lot sooner than this week. But at number 21, I think we're dropping down a tier and the risk factor is just too high. I don't think I actually want to start Cooper Rush versus Tampa, but it's a decent matchup. There's no weather, and Cooper Rush did have some upside last week. There's a chance it does work out, but I'd probably bet against it. At 22, we have Drew Lock, who gets a top 4 matchup against the Falcons, but Drew Lock does offer 58 rushing yards per game in 2 starts this season. Lock has a high floor thanks to the rushing yards, but no ceiling. You need some touchdowns to go to neighbors, and they probably won't, so I don't think I'm starting Lock. But from a floor standpoint, I would expect at least 14 points thanks to his rushing yards available against the Falcons. But at 23, we have Mac Jones at the Raiders, and it is a good matchup. Weather's not a factor, and Brian Thomas Jr. can always pad his stats. I would expect at least 1 touchdown to go to Brian Thomas Jr. So Mac Jones maybe gives you like 14 points as well, but I don't expect the high ceiling. I would be benching Mac Jones for sure. And then Mason Rudolph is actually like a league average quarterback when he gets the start and plays, but the matchup against the Colts is bottom 6. I would probably pass on Rudolph. But then in the rain, I'm also going to pass on Geno Smith. No thank you against the Vikings. His knee injury really caps his rushing upside, and I don't expect multiple touchdown passes from Geno Smith any week. So no thanks with him. I'm also going to bench CJ Stroud at the Chiefs. Stroud has been terrible in fantasy this season. The last month only averaging 13 points per game. That's quarterback 23. And the Chiefs matchup is bottom 5. No thank you with Stroud at all. At 27, I think we're dropping down a tier. I'm definitely benching any quarterback the rest of the way. I have no excitement with Jordan Love in the snow against the Saints. I just don't think it'll be a good, safe option. I see no ceiling, honestly. I think they're just going to lean on Josh Jacobs and the run game and kill the clock against the Saints. But then Russell Wilson only put up 6 points against the Baltimore Ravens in his first game, and without George Pickens, I see no upside once again. So definitely benching Russell Wilson. He's been in a slump lately as well, and without Pickens, I see no upside at all. I'm definitely benching Russ this week. At number 29, I'm also going to ignore Bryce Young versus Arizona. In the cold weather game, I'm going to pass. I think Chuba Hubbard will be their main path for success. But Jalen Coker and Thielen have been playing pretty well. Maybe I'm discrediting him too much, but in the playoffs, I do not want to trust Bryce Young at all. At number 30, there is some rushing upside for Dorian Thompson-Robinson, DTR at the Bengals. The Bengals are actually the number 1 matchup at the moment for quarterbacks. They have allowed over 40 plus rushing yards per game to quarterbacks 4 times this season. So that's all I'm hoping for. It's not a surprise, though, that Winston got benched. He has 10 turnovers the last 4 games, and hopefully Thompson-Robinson doesn't throw more than 1 interception this week. There's some upside because of the matchup, but I wouldn't start DTR off the waiver wire. At 31, I'm definitely benching Desmond Ridder. He did not look very good last week. And against the Jaguars, while it's a good matchup, I'm not expecting double-digit fantasy points from Ridder at all. And then in the snow, I think Rattler's the worst quarterback on the week. There's no chance I'm starting Spencer Rattler at the Packers. But that's the quarterback position. Now let's pivot to the tight end position, where first I'd like to show you the matchups. These are the last 5 games for tight end matchups, how the defenses have been performing against the position. And overall, there are a few good spots. I think if you get over 11.7, that is a good spot. The top 8 are the ones I'm chasing. But by far above everyone else would be the top matchup on this chart. It's the Cincinnati Bengals, who go up against Jordan Akins and the Browns this week. So maybe Jordan Akins actually is the play. He probably got a lot of second team reps with DTR the last few weeks in practice, but I don't think I'd be trusting him off the wire. I think it's kind of irrelevant for Jordan Akins. But then the number 2 matchup is the Texans, who get the Chiefs this week. I think the combo of Travis Kelce, Noah Gray is viable in your lineup. I think they both offer a decent fantasy week in week 16. But at number 3, we have the Cleveland Browns, who get Mike Gesicki. And on the season, they're not the best matchup, but lately they are pretty good. So maybe an upgrade for Gesicki. But then George Kittle, I think, is a very trustworthy, very safe start against the Dolphins. They are a top 4 matchup themselves. But then on the year, one of the best matchups overall consistently is the Las Vegas Raiders, and they get Brenton Strange and the Jaguars this week. So Strange was targeted double digits last week, and maybe it happens again. Maybe Mac Jones really trusts him. Another situation where second string players maybe have a better chemistry than other starters and that quarterback. But number 6 in terms of matchups is the Eagles. So Zack Ertz gets a positive spot here in a revenge game. I do think Ertz probably scores a touchdown once again. He did a few weeks ago in the same matchup. And then number 7 would be Denver for Hayden Hurst and Stone Smart last night. But the 8th best matchup is for Sam LaPorta. The Chicago Bears are a good spot to be in at tight end. So those are the upgrades in terms of matchups. Then we see a very wide average tier, roughly 11 to 10 points that they give up every week. And then beyond 9 points, 8 points and below, those are the big downgrades. So the bottom 6 would be Atlanta. That's the worst matchup in general, but for Daniel Bellinger, I don't think it matters. Then Jonnu Smith actually gets a difficult matchup. On the season, the Niners are bottom 2 against the position, and lately even worse, maybe Jonnu Smith is held in check against San Francisco. The 3rd worst matchup is the Chargers against Adam Troutman. He played like shit last night. And then 4th worst would be Detroit against Cole Kmet, but Kmet actually has very good stats in his career against Detroit. He has a multiple touchdown game at home against them a couple years ago, and maybe Kmet actually has some upside, but he's been terrible lately. I don't think I would be trusting Cole Kmet that much. And then the last player I think actually is someone you might consider that gets a downgrade would be Tucker Kraft, and the Saints have been a tough matchup all year, barely 8 points allowed all season to tight ends. So that's a slight downgrade, but then Tommy Tremble and Jatavian Sanders against Arizona, I doubt you're starting them. Noah Fant against the Vikings has not earned any trust. And then lastly, Tyler Conklin of the Jets against the Rams is the last downgrade to mention. So it's really just Jonnu Smith and Tucker Kraft who get a slight red flag this week. In general, though, I would be upgrading Travis Kelce, Noah Gray, George Kittle, Brenton Strange, Zack Ertz, and Sam LaPorta. Those are the matchup stats I would like to mention. But in general, matchups aren't really like the most important for tight ends. A lot of those are dependent on who they've been facing. And I think how they've been performing is a bit more important to bring up. So this is a chart of the last 4 weeks for the tight end position, and the top scorers on average the last 4 games are in blue. On the season is their 2024 average per game. And someone who looks like a league winner right now would be Jonnu Smith. The tight end won the last month, averaging 15.7 points per game. It's boosted his season average above double digits now. And Jonnu Smith, if you have him, there is no chance you're benching. Even if he puts up a bagel in regulation, he had 10 plus points in overtime alone a couple weeks ago. So it's a bad matchup on paper, bottom 2, but I wouldn't worry about it. I think Jonnu Smith still deserves to be started no matter what in your lineup. Then behind him is Trey McBride, who's on even more of a heater, but is super consistent all season long. McBride has to be started. He's averaging 97 yards per game on 10 catches. Despite no touchdowns, the floor is massive. McBride would be an excellent flex play, even at wide receiver. He's one of the best options you can find. But at number 3 on this list, might surprise you, it's Pat Freiermuth, who's been on a tear lately, especially with that George Pickens. He's very reliable in the red zone. 3 touchdowns the last 4 games for Pat Freiermuth on just under 50 yards per game. The volume isn't very high, but when Freiermuth catches it, it's usually down the field and good for a touchdown at least once per game. So love Freiermuth right now. Very safe start. And maybe the matchup stats I'll bring up later are a reason to bench him. But maybe the hot streak does end on the season. He's still only averaging 7.7 points. And that would be a way more average player on the year. So it's pretty touchdown dependent. Freiermuth without a touchdown would be a liability in your lineup. Beyond Pat Freiermuth, though, a slight downgrade for George Kittle lately. He hasn't been the same player after his injury, but weather's been a major reason why, and I would still be starting George Kittle regardless. The matchup is also great for him. Kittle is definitely a must start in your lineup. Right behind Kittle, we have Brock Bowers, who with Desmond Ridder probably is not the safest start anymore. His numbers did take a big hit as Ridder got the start last week. So I'd still start Brock Bowers. He can obviously bounce back in a major way, but with Ridder, there's a reason why he was a backup rotating teams the last few years. Ridder's not safe at all to trust. So Bowers, more of a low-end, high-end option, but still a must-start. In general, you cannot bench Bowers. He's the tight end 2 this season. Then we have Noah Gray right behind him at number 6, and he's rather touchdown dependent, but with 3 touchdowns the last 4 games, one of the few guys you trust in the red zone to score. So Noah Gray, probably a decent start this week. And then at number 7, we do have Mark Andrews as well. Just like Noah Gray, also scoring 3 touchdowns last month and averaging roughly 40 yards. They're in the same tier. You're going to get about the same performance from Noah Gray and Andrews most of the time. At number 8, Zack Ertz has also scored 3 touchdowns last month, but less than 40 yards per game from him. The 3 of them at 10.5 points roughly are very safe top 10 plays. I would be definitely starting Ertz, Andrews, and Gray, expecting a touchdown in my lineup. The upside is pretty high with them. Then we have Sam LaPorta, who is a little touchdown dependent. Sometimes he doesn't score at all. Sometimes he scores multiple touchdowns. But the 2 touchdowns he has put up the last month did come against Chicago a few weeks ago. So he's over 10 points per game on average. I would start LaPorta. His upside's way too high. With no Montgomery, they're going to have to throw it more in his direction. At number 10, I'm probably going to bench Austin Hooper. I think the good stretch of games for him with touchdowns is probably over. It's a tough matchup as well against Buffalo. I don't think I'm trusting Austin Hooper this week. And then at number 11, he's pretty touchdown reliant, but Tucker Kraft does still remain top 12. He's been pretty consistent all year long, averaging about 9-8 points all season long. At number 12, there is a asterisk on this player, but Brenton Strange in 5 games without Evan Ingram this season is averaging 8.6 fantasy points on average. So that's really good. It's way better than his season average of 4.4, and it does rank as tight end 12. I think Brenton Strange is actually a pretty decent option in fantasy from a floor standpoint. I do think Mac Jones does trust him as the number 2 target in Jacksonville with all the injuries they have. It's just Brian Thomas Jr., Brenton Strange, and Travis Etienne. Right behind Strange, we have TJ Hockenson, who does not score touchdowns, but is usually good for about 60 yards per game. Hockenson is a very safe floor play in the top 15, but without a touchdown, you probably will not surpass 10 points. Then we have Juwan Johnson, who's pretty touchdown dependent, and with the backup quarterback, I do not trust Juwan in the snow. Followed by him, Hunter Henry is pretty much tied with Travis Kelce. Neither player scoring touchdowns, but both catch about 5.5 receptions for roughly 50 yards per game. They're both equally good floor plays, but that's not what you signed up for with Kelce when you drafted him. Henry has been a decent surprise, but more of a floor play this season. Then Okonkwo really had a good game with Rudolph last week, but it was an excellent matchup. This will be a big test. I don't know if I actually trust Okonkwo, but he is now inside the top 20 averaging 7.5 points per game. Outside the top 17, I only want to mention a few players that have big names like Dalton Kincaid, who has only one touchdown, not a safe option, kind of unreliable, but does average 7.3 targets per week. His catch percentage is pretty low, only 3.5 catches for 35 yards, but Kincaid could pop off. The volume is there. It's one of the highest among all tight ends at the moment. Beyond Kincaid, there aren't that many like reliable names to mention, but Isaiah Likely could always pop off. He's number 23 on this list, and behind him would be Cade Otton, who's been fading heavily lately. I don't trust Cade Otton right now. And then way down the list, we have Cole Kmet at tight end number 30, but he is still higher with 4 points per game than Kyle Pitts, who only averages 2 points per game. He's the tight end 41, way down the list. Kyle Pitts is a bust yet again this season. But maybe Michael Penix can recharge that upside. Maybe Pitts does finally bounce back now that Cousins has been benched. But those are the scoring trends I wanted to mention at tight end. I don't want to spend too much time on it. I just want to get to the rankings. So these are my tight end rankings this week. At number 1, I trust Trey McBride. His floor is just so secure, and the only knock on him is the fact that he hasn't scored touchdowns this season, but here is where it could bounce back. The Panthers have allowed 10 touchdowns to the position on the season. That is the league most, a lot higher than even like the third most in the NFL. If there's ever a week where McBride catches a touchdown, it's on the road against the Panthers. This is the spot to expect a touchdown for tight ends against Carolina. So McBride is the tight end 1, in my opinion, a bust-proof floor every single week. And this week, I think the ceiling is viable. But at number 2, I think George Kittle will find the end zone, a big bounce-back game for their offense. There's no weather this time, and the Dolphins are a top 4 matchup right now, and they give up 72 yards per game to the position, 3 touchdowns on the season, but Kittle is a reliable option to score himself. So he's averaging 75 yards. I think Kittle is a lock in your lineup no matter what. He's been so effective this season. I would definitely start Kittle. I don't think they trust Debo anymore. Kittle will be the go-to option for Brock Purdy in this game. So those are the top 2 elite plays. I think there's no chance you're benching either player, but I'm definitely starting both Jonnu Smith and Brock Bowers in the next tier. But there is a slight red flag with both of them. I think Jonnu Smith in a terrible matchup maybe is not as effective as he has been the last month. The Niners on the season only give up 35 receiving yards per game to tight ends and only 3 touchdowns on the season to them as well. So I'd probably still expect a touchdown for Jonnu. He's been so lights out, there's no way I'm benching him, but I don't think he's as good as Kittle or McBride, given the matchup is difficult. On the year, there's very few yards that you can put up on the Niners. So while Jonnu is the tight end 1 lately, you kind of are shocked that that's the case, and a regression down to the mean wouldn't be that big of a surprise. He kind of feels due for a dud. He almost had it, if not for overtime, a couple weeks ago. So Jonnu at number 3, a minor red flag, but as the tight end 1, I wouldn't be benching him. He's been too good to bench. At number 4, we have Brock Bowers versus the Jaguars, and with Desmond Ridder, he's just not the same player. It's not as high of a ceiling, but the floor is probably still fine. I doubt Michael Mayer has another good game like he did 2 weeks ago, and Bowers is still a top 5 option, still a reliable player. He got you here. I would have to start him if I've been relying on Bowers all season. Beyond Bowers, though, I think we're dropping down a tier, and it's way more risky, but there is always some upside with this player. Sam LaPorta at number 5 gets a road matchup at Chicago, and last time he faced off against the Bears 2 weeks ago, he had 2 touchdowns, but otherwise he's pretty bad against Chicago. He only averages 16 yards per game in 3 career games versus the Bears. So if not for those 2 touchdowns, he's a major bust in this spot, and I would not expect many yards from him, but the volume should probably step up. Given Montgomery's out, Goff will have to throw it a lot more. So given the 2 touchdowns happened just a couple weeks ago, I'm going to have to start LaPorta. But even in that game, he had 6 targets, 3 catches, 6 yards, and 2 touchdowns. Only 14.1 points, and 12 of them were on touchdowns. So without it, you will get burned. There is a major risk factor with LaPorta, but I think given the upside and ceiling, I think they have to give him the ball this week. I'm definitely starting LaPorta. The ceiling is too high. I would start him at number 5. Number 6, I'm expecting a touchdown for Zack Ertz in a revenge game against the Eagles, and that's why I'm definitely starting him. He's the tight end 8 the last month, and the Eagles on the season have given up 5 touchdowns overall, along with 41 yards per game. I think Ertz is going to give you his average stat line, about 4 catches, 35 yards, and I think the touchdown will hit. At home, I think in a revenge game, he will score on his former team. He scored on the road a few weeks ago. I think it'll happen again. He scored 13.7 points in week 11. I really expect a similar stat line to repeat. At number 7, it's an upgrade that I'm a bit worried to like fully endorse, honestly, but I do think Dalton Kincaid is going to have a good game here because while he rarely scores touchdowns this season, he's only the tight end 19 the last month. The volume is reliable. 7.3 targets per game is kind of a bust-proof target share in this offense. So 6.8 points is his floor. I do think 7 points is kind of guaranteed with Kincaid, but in this matchup against the Patriots, he has dominated it in his history. Last year in 2 games versus New England, he averaged 11.1 points per game on 7.5 targets. That's his volume this season. 6 catches, 81 yards, and no touchdowns. So if you're telling me these numbers repeat, then 11 points is his floor. And if he finally finds the end zone, then Kincaid will go over 15. So I would be starting him for sure. I think Kincaid is a solid top 10 play. I think from a floor standpoint, you will get 7 points. You're not going to be egregiously upset if that's all he offers. I think he will go over 10 though. He normally does that against New England in his career. At number 8 and 9, I'm starting both of the Chiefs tight ends. I think Noah Gray will score a touchdown this week, and Travis Kelce will have a decent floor game in terms of yards. This is the number 2 matchup. The Texans against the tight end position allow 69 yards per game overall this year, along with 6 touchdowns. That ranks top 5 in terms of matchups. So I do think Gray will find the end zone. That's usually what he's been doing with like 5 touchdowns the last 5 games. And then Kelce, while he's in a slump, is still offering 51 yards per game. So I do think the floor is fine with Kelce. Just like Kincaid, I would anticipate about 7 points for Kelce. As long as Mahomes is getting the start, I think Kelce's floor is fine. In a positive matchup, I would consider him top 10. So Gray, I think, has the higher ceiling with the touchdown. That's why I rank him higher. And he has been the better option, a top 6 player at the position. Meanwhile, Kelce is league average with no touchdowns, though. If the touchdown hits, he will have a high ceiling himself. So start both Chiefs tight ends. I like both of them this week versus Houston on Saturday. I think they play well. At number 10, I'm also starting Mark Andrews versus the Steelers, but I will mention he actually doesn't play great against Pittsburgh. In 5 career games versus the Steelers, he averages 8.5 points per game on yards alone. He does not have a single touchdown in 10 career games versus Pittsburgh. So I think the ceiling is capped for Andrews, but in general, he offers 5.4 catches on 8.6 targets for 58 yards against them, and that's a safe floor as well. I expect about 7-8 points from Andrews, kind of guaranteed, against the Steelers. I think he'll be fine from a yard standpoint, but again, not a single touchdown in his career against the Steelers. I don't think he finds the end zone. So that's why I only have him at number 10. Usually I rank him like number 7 or 6, but this week I don't see the ceiling really that massive. I think Andrews is more of a floor play. At number 10, though, I would be starting him. You drafted him, and he's been worth a start most of the time. At number 11, I have TJ Hockenson at the Seahawks, and he's usually a good floor play, averaging 60 yards per game. Darnold does get involved a lot, but he does not score touchdowns. That's the problem with Hockenson. The ceiling is capped. But as long as the weather doesn't completely neuter this offense, then Hockenson does offer a safe floor play. At least 8 points is what he's averaging as of late. So that's the only red flag why he's not in the tier above. But at number 11, I think Hockenson is still a fine play, a reliable floor play at the position. At number 12, I have Pat Freiermuth at Baltimore, and he has been on a heater, averaging 11.4 points. That is tight end 3 the last month, and usually you want to ride the hot hand, but he's very touchdown dependent, and this week against the Ravens, it is not a good matchup at all. In his last 5 games versus Baltimore, Freiermuth is averaging only 5.9 points per game with only 1 touchdown in those 5 games. So I don't think he scores this week. I think the Russell Wilson offense is really depleted and low efficiency this week is what I'm projecting. In his career, he only has 1 game with over 36 yards versus Baltimore as well. So very reliant on touchdowns to have any upside. And that's why this week he's a big red flag. He's been playing well, but without a touchdown, you will get burned. I think I'm going to pass on Freiermuth at tight end 12. I'd probably bench him, but in a 12-team league, he is on the cusp of the start consideration bubble, in my opinion. Number 13, he's been A decent bet for touchdowns this season at number 13, I got Kraft of the Packers, but in the snow, I'm a bit concerned. I would be worried. The matchup's also bottom 5. The Saints have only allowed one tight end touchdown on the year, and that was Cade Otton. It's a bit random if it's going to happen, and I don't think Kraft has a high ceiling at all if it doesn't. So a downgrade for him as well. While maybe you trust him based on his proven track record this year, I think this week is a time to fade him. Kraft at 13, I don't think is the best start this week. At 14, though, I think we're just chasing upside, and I have Isaiah Likely versus the Steelers. If Andrews is not going to score a touchdown, it's more likely to go to Likely. So with Rashad Bateman banged up, another receiver also on the injury report in Baltimore, they probably have to rely on Likely a bit more. So Henry has been locked up. The Steelers can definitely shut him down, and I think Lamar has to trust some of the receivers more in order to win. So it's going to be a low-scoring game. There's not a lot of touchdowns offered in the first place, but last time against Pittsburgh, he did score a touchdown as well. Likely actually has 2 touchdowns in his last 3 games versus the Steelers, an average of 8.8 points, and that includes a fumble. So without it, an average of 9.5 points. Likely is actually a pretty reliable option against Pittsburgh historically. So an upgrade for him, obviously not the safest bet, but we know he has upside at 14. I think if you're chasing the ceiling, I do like Likely quite a bit. I think he does find the end zone in this matchup. At 15, I have Brenton Strange at Las Vegas, and without Evan Ingram, Strange is actually a pretty good start. 8.6 points per game in those 5 matchups, and with 2 touchdowns, he's a decent option to chase. The matchup's also top 5. The Raiders have given up 7 tight end touchdowns on the season, along with 73 yards per game. If Mac Jones really trusts him, then expect close to double-digit targets. Once again, I think Strange is a very interesting pickup. Not a bad option, but I'd probably rather just stick with Freiermuth or Kraft then pick up Strange off the waiver wire. Same goes with Okonkwo. Are you really going to pick him up off the waiver wire? Last week, the matchup was great, an elite matchup against the Bengals, and he will be tested against the Colts this week. Will it actually repeat? I probably doubt it. So good luck with Okonkwo. I'm probably not going to start him, but maybe you're going to chase the points if you're desperate. At 16, you could do worse. I did recommend Hayden Hurst yesterday, expecting him to get the most targets at tight end for the Chargers. I was wrong. It was Stone Smart, but still neither player was very effective. Hayden Hurst did go in motion on the goal line, but he did not get the target. He was not a safe start at all. So this is the cutoff point. I think at this point it's way too risky to trust, but Cole Kmet does have 3 touchdowns in 5 career games against Detroit. There is a chance that he pays off. In 2022, Kmet had a 2 touchdown game against the Lions. So maybe it happens again. There is always some upside it happens, but I would expect Caleb to only trust the receivers in the end zone like he normally does. At 19, maybe Michael Penix saves Kyle Pitts' season, but I really doubt it. I'm not going to trust Pitts, given he's been ass this season. Number 20 is Cade Otton, who has had some good games this season, but not lately, not safe enough to trust. I would probably bench him, but in Sunday night primetime, maybe Baker does get him the ball enough to pay off. And then outside the top 20, I'm definitely benching these next 10 players, but do just want to mention them. I don't trust Dalton Schultz at the moment against the Chiefs. It's not a great upgrade. In Dallas, Jake Ferguson appears to have overtaken Schoonmaker again, but against the Bucks, I'm not going to trust him. Austin Hooper and Hunter Henry in the snow, I'm going to pass on them. Jordan Akins at Cincinnati gets a great matchup, but the backup for DTR, no thank you there. Mike Gesicki, Grant Calcaterra could maybe score a touchdown, but I think they're the last players in that low-end tier. And then Juwan Johnson, Noah Fant, and Daniel Bellinger, I think are fuck no candidates. Way too risky, in my opinion. So those are my tight end rankings. Now I'm going to show you my defensive rankings and try and go fast because this video is pretty long. The Packers actively snowing in this game on Monday night against the second string offense. Even Kamara's out for the Saints. Every single position for the Saints is a backup on offense. So definitely start the Packers. They're the best option this week. At number 2, the Bills in a 16-degree temperature against a rookie quarterback in division. There's chance that it's going to snow. I'm definitely starting the Bills as an elite option. Those are the 2 best plays. Definitely must starts. Better than everyone else, in my opinion. Then number 3 is the Vikings at Seattle. There's a 65% chance of rain against a banged-up Geno Smith. I do trust Brian Flores' defense this week. At number 4, we get the Falcons versus the Giants. And at home against Drew Lock with a rookie quarterback making his debut, they probably play conservatively and step up on defense. They really demolished Desmond Ridder, and I do trust them at home against the Giants again. At 5-6, I did tell you to start the Broncos and Chargers last night, and that was the wrong call. That game turned into a shootout. I expected more field goals. The touchdowns were kind of a shocker, in my opinion. Less than 3 points from both. That was a bad call by me. So keep that in mind. Maybe I'm wrong about every rank this week, but the Broncos and Chargers sounded like a safe play. They had been good defenses on the year. Then I think we're dropping down a tier. There's always some risk with the Ravens and the Steelers, but usually it's a game that goes under 20 points, and I do trust the floor this week. I'm not going to worry about them that much. The talent of the Steelers and the Ravens lately has really paid off. The Steelers normally win here, and I actually think the loser gets a better playoff matchup against the Texans instead of a home against the Chargers, but it'll be a close one. The Ravens and Steelers will step up on defense. The Chiefs and Texans game on Saturday is also really interesting. I think a very similar tier in terms of what to expect. I would start all four defenses on Saturday, the Chiefs and Texans 9-10, the Ravens and Steelers at 7-8. You know both games are going to be kind of weird and low scoring. I think on Saturday it won't be a shootout in either of them. So maybe you'd rather watch the college football playoff instead, but I think from a defensive standpoint in fantasy, I'd be starting all four defenses. I rank them all top 10 this week. And then the next tier is a bit more risky, but now it's more like the streaming territory. There's a world where they don't pay off at all, but I still see some upside and talent for most of them. At number 11, we have the Cardinals, followed by the Panthers. That game is going to be 41 degrees. It's on the road across country in the morning time slot for Arizona. I think the Panthers will play them well. Should be a low score, but the Cardinals on the road at Carolina definitely sounds like the better spot. I would be starting Arizona above Carolina. But at number 13, we have the Eagles at Washington. The Philly defense is elite, but Daniels can also perform at an elite level. I still think they're talented enough to trust from a floor standpoint, but definitely risky against Washington on the road. Number 14, we have the Seahawks versus the Vikings, and the rain is the only reason why I'm willing to bet against Darnold, but after two perfect games indoors at home, I'm a bit worried about it. Going on the road, Darnold might not be the same player. The rain should help you a little bit in terms of floor. But at 15, we have the Bucks at Dallas. Are you really afraid of Cooper Rush? And then at 16, we have the Colts versus the Titans. Are you really afraid of Mason Rudolph? And then at 17, we have the Titans at the Colts. Are you really afraid of Anthony Richardson? So all three of these teams on defense aren't really the best every week, but do have some upside. There is a chance they do play well. And then beyond this point, I'm definitely benching the Jaguars and Raiders. That game is going to be very weird. Same with the Rams and the Jets. I think that game is more of a shootout in the cold. And then the Bears-Lions game, I think, is also going to be a very strange shootout as well. I wouldn't trust either defense. And then the Saints in the snow against the Packers. Maybe the snow helps them, but I wouldn't trust them at all. Josh Jacobs should dominate. And then the Giants at Atlanta. Bijan Robinson and Algier can be good enough to shut him down. Even if Penix turns it over a lot, the Giants don't feel like a good start at all. And then I'm definitely benching the Bengals and Browns. That game is going to be so strange. Both defenses probably suck in division. And then the Niners-Dolphins game also feels like a shootout. I'll pass there. And then the Commanders, no way I'll bet against the Eagles. The Cowboys, Baker and Evans are going to go off, so fuck no. And then the Patriots at Buffalo, fuck no, am I testing Josh Allen. So those are all my rankings this week, the top 20 at all three positions here on the screen. And at quarterback, I think you have to start everyone in the top 7. Allen, Burrow, and Mayfield, I think, are the true elite top 3. And then Jalen Hurts, Jayden Daniels, Jared Goff, and Lamar Jackson just have too much name value, too much of an elite ceiling to bench. But I'm a bit worried about Lamar against the Steelers. He never plays well historically. And then Goff in the cold maybe doesn't play well either. Usually doesn't go over 15 points against the Bears. But Hurts and Daniels with the rushing upside are too valuable. I would start them. The ceiling is too enticing in the top 7. But then Darnold all the way through Justin Herbert, I'll think are in the same tier, all streaming options with upside. And I expect the safe floor from everyone, at least like 15, 16 points, no matter what. But we saw with Nix and Herbert, you can go over 20 points with any of these players. So I would be trying to start them. I think they're definitely the safer options, but outside the top 12, you may need to be in a super flex format to start anyone beyond Brock Purdy or Patrick Mahomes. But then 16 through 20, I think have massive upside this week. I really trust that that's possible. However, they also carry a lot of risk and have not lived up to expectation many times in the past. So if you want to avoid getting burned, then go ahead and bench him. But in Superflex, if you have to start 2 quarterbacks and you're on the lower end of the top 20, I do like these 5 players. From an upside standpoint, I could easily see 20 plus points from all of them. But beyond the top 20, I don't think it matters. I'd be benching everyone else who's not ranked on the screen. At tight end, I only think I trust the top 10. Even TJ Hockenson at 11, maybe not the safest play, but I do think 11 through 16 are the streamers that you could consider in a pinch. Maybe they do pop off in this week, but definitely start McBride and Kittle. They're the top 2 options. Jonnu and Bowers are definitely safe enough to start, but have a couple red flags. And then LaPorta through Andrews, a bit lower floors, but also carry massive ceilings. Should be fine top 10 options. The players I'm trusting this week. But at defense, I'm trying to start the top 10 if I can. I was wrong about the Broncos and Chargers, but I do think the rest of them should be safe options. At least they won't burn you and go in the negative. They should all go over 8 points, in my opinion. But beyond the top 10, it's a bit more risky. 11 through 17 are the toss-up streamers that maybe have some ceiling appeal, but in general are more so floor plays for about 5-6 points in my estimation. So that's it for the video. If you enjoyed, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. But that's it for me. My name's Adam Riancho, and thank you so much for watching. Nice and blunt.